Welcome to the Israel Now Forum webinar series. I'm Maura Schreier-Fleming, Chairman of the Israel Now Forum Speakers Committee. The November in-person Israel Now Forum is scheduled for Wednesday, October 28th in Dallas. We want to thank our webinar partner, Southwest Jewish Congress. Today's webinar on Hamas in the United States is with David Collins, Senior Research Fellow at George Washington University's Program on Extremism. The Program on Extremism is a leading academic research center founded in 2015. Program researchers analyze extremist ideologies like domestic extremism, global jihadism, and anti-Semitism. Their work provides actionable analysis for policymakers and law enforcement. David is a retired FBI special agent with over 29 years of distinguished law enforcement experience. At the DC FBI field office, he led complex counterterrorism investigations, primarily focusing on high-profile targets within the Hamas and Muslim Brotherhood organizations. Later, he took on leadership roles in program management for counterterrorism operations across the world. He's received numerous awards for his work, including the U.S. Attorney General's Award for Significant Complex Counterterrorism Investigation. Laura Burns was originally scheduled today, but was called away on urgent business. Please use the Q&A Zoom feature to submit your questions during the webinar. We'll have time for questions. So David, let's start with what Hamas is and its connection to the Muslim Brotherhood. So maybe you can take us back to the 1988 meeting of the US-based Palestine Committee and what it was charged to do in the United States by the International Muslim Brotherhood.
Thank you, Maura. Thank you for the opportunity to spend a little bit of time with you today to talk about these important topics and these important groups. If I could, I'll back up a little bit further than 1988, and I'll kind of go back to 1928. So in 1928, the Muslim Brotherhood was created, and its attributed founder is Hassan al-Banna in Cairo, Egypt. And the Muslim Brotherhood has chapters all around the world. They have members in roughly 80 different countries. And Islamism, the different entities, the disciplines we do at George Washington University is you stated three of them: the anti-Semitism, the global jihadist, and the domestic violent extremist. But then the fourth one is the Islamism. And the Muslim Brotherhood is an Islamist organization, which is different than being a Muslim who just believes in Islam. There's a distinct difference between those two. Islamism is a political ideology that's based on the belief of all aspects of life and society and government should be administered according to a very strict interpretation of Sharia law. And so that started in 1928, and then it sort of developed and gradually got bigger throughout the decades. And then the first Muslim Brotherhood chapter appeared in the United States around 1963. So fast forward to 1987. There's a lot of fighting going on in Gaza, and there's a lot of different groups there. There's a Palestinian chapter of the Muslim Brotherhood that's operating in Gaza. There's also a U.S. chapter. The kind of the two that I'll talk about is the U.S. chapter of the Muslim Brotherhood that was in the United States since the early 60s, like I said. And then you had the Palestinian chapter of the Muslim Brotherhood operating in Gaza around the late 1980s and 1987. There's other sort of groups fighting there as well. And I'm sorry, I have a message. I equate that to like neighborhood-based gangs because I worked my last year and a half, I worked neighborhood-based gangs. And so they all sort of compete for each other for control of a particular neighborhood. And that was, to me, that was the same thing that was going on at the time. You've got the Palestinian chapter Muslim Brotherhood doing fighting. You have Palestinian Islamic Jihad. You have the PLO, the Fatah movement. You have all these different elements. And so they're all sort of fighting for control. So in 87, the International Muslim Brotherhood decided to allow that chapter to create Hamas, and that's where its founding goes back to. And Hamas, you can break it up into three groups. And if you think of it like a pyramid, it's probably the easiest way to think of it. The top part of the pyramid is its political bureau. It's a 15-member political bureau. Its leadership obviously does not sit in Gaza where the fighting is. They sit somewhere else. For years, they were based in Syria, and then with the fall of the Bashar al-Assad regime, they then moved to Doha. So after the the October 2023 attack, you see, I think it was Israel that's firing rockets into Doha. Some people, my family, they're like, "Hey, wait a minute, the fighting is in Gaza. Why are there rockets going into
You
to
mean Iran
Doha?"
fighting? You mean Iran stuff sending rockets, right?
No, no, no. This is before that. This
Oh,
is
I'm sorry. You're right. You're right. You're right.
this is
Yeah, because there was a
before
terrorist there.
what we
Yeah,
currently have going
yeah.
on. So you have that. Sorry. So you have that going on. So they're sending rockets in. Who they're attacking, they're targeting that senior leadership of Hamas, which is that political bureau.
Right.
The next middle branch or middle section of that triangle is the Izzeldin al-Qassam brigades. And Izzeldin al-Qassam was a Syrian preacher back in the late 1800s. I think he died in around 1930s. And he would put together bands of fighters to fight. And so Hamas named their militant branch, that middle section of the pyramid, the Izzeldin al-Qassam brigades. And then there's a number of different factions within those brigades, but that's your fighting element that's there in Gaza. And then the lower part of that triangle is the social branch. And that's really where your Hamas members in Gaza are winning the hearts and minds of all those folks there and taking over. And once they have the hearts and minds, then they sort of have control. Like, hey, we'll keep your hospital safe, but you're going to allow us to keep our missiles. We're going to allow us to build, tunnels, for example,
Mhm.
under the hospital. So that gets created in 1987, and like any good parent organization, the Muslim Brotherhood said, "Hey, we've created this Hamas entity in 1987." So in 1988, they sent out, which I think is what you're referring to in 1988, they sent out sort of directions to all of its chapters around the world, like, hey, that you need to support our new entity in Gaza.
And at that committee meeting, the Palestine committee meeting in '88, what what organizations were created? Because they were tasked with addressing the media, getting money for Hamas, political support. So talk about those three organizations that would be the front-facing in America organizations.
So at the time in 1988, they said the International Muslim Brotherhood sent out, and the FBI recovered these documents from a criminal search warrant that was done in 2004. And the Bureau got, I mean, luck goes a lot with this, and so it got lucky and did a overt criminal search warrant at the residence of what was the archivist for the Muslim Brotherhood in the U.S. So just boxes and boxes and boxes and pallets of documents. And so I tell people like, look, this is not George Washington University's, analysis, and this is our conclusion. Like this is their documents.
Mhm.
And so in that we found, the FBI found in 1988 that the International Muslim Brotherhood had sent out that order saying, hey, you need to support our new entity Hamas, and you need to do that with financial support, with political support, and really with media as well. The Islamic Association for Palestine was a Muslim Brotherhood organization that was already in existence. It sort of got redirected to focus on this issue. So the IAP is one of them, the United Association for Studies and Research, or UASR.
The
Um,
think tank.
was the second one. And then the third, which is what most people have heard of, is what later became the Holy Land Foundation. But it started as the Occupied Land Fund, but it was HLF. And so those three organizations were here in the U.S. to help the cause for Hamas. Um, and they each had their own role. So IAP, so I'm sorry, we'll start with UASR. So the United Association for Studies and Research, they would do, you could call it research, and then it would be, negative towards Israel. It would be sort of pro Hamas or pro Palestinian, and then the Islamic Association of Palestine would then publish and sort of propagandize that information and push it out. And then the Holy Land Foundation, their role was to, collect all the money and get that overseas. And so that's what led to the federal government's prosecution and ultimate shutdown of HLF around the 2001 timeframe that led to convictions of its principals and seizure of, I think, 12 or $13 million.
So let's fast forward to what's called the Philadelphia meeting.
Mhm,
There was a meeting in Philadelphia in 1993
mhm.
that had the top Hamas activists in the United States. And because of probable cause, the FBI was able to wiretap that meeting. And what was uncovered by those wiretaps was that there were internal discussions of how to improve the activities in support of Hamas within the United States and how to hide that they are supporting a terrorist organization, although at that time they were not designated a terrorist organization. It only happened in 1997 that the Treasury Department did that. So at that Philadelphia meeting, who was at this meeting and what was their primary objective?
So I'm gonna back up a little bit just to kind of frame this and kind of give you context. So
Okay.
if you were to take terrorist or terrorist groups, and if you were to just put them into two buckets, you have your jihadists and your Islamists. Your jihadists, I would argue, are those groups like ISIS and Al Qaeda. And
Mhm.
everyone sees those, they know those. I could probably show you a picture of a ISIS fighter. I could show it to my 18-year-old daughter, and she would say, that is not a good thing. That's a looks like a terrorist, right? And so their timeline is they want it right now. And so you'll see in New York, I mean, a few weeks ago, we had a number of ISIS-inspired attacks where they're wanting change, they're wanting that like right now. So their timelines are different. The Islamists, they know this will be a 100, 200 multi-generational fight. And so they're much more strategic. There's not a lot of strategy when you have two kids that go to Gracie mansion in New York and throw these
Bomb.
TATP they had made or allegedly made to try to that not a lot of strategy in that.
No.
The Islamists, they're much more strategic, they're much more thoughtful. Um, and that to me, that type of mindset works really, really well here in the US. Because if you think about it, how far do us Americans, how far do we plan out? We think in terms of spring break and maybe summer vacation. That's about as far out as we plan. The Islamists, they take a much different approach in that. So their strategy is just different. And so September 13th, 1993. So you have the first Intifada from 19 started in 1987, which is sort of when Hamas got kicked off, was during that fighting. And there was a lot of fighting during that first Intifada from 1987 to 1993. And what brought closure to that first Intifada was the signing of the Oslo Peace Accords in Washington, D.C. And that happened in the middle of September. I believe it was September 13th of 1993. And there's a very famous photograph with President Bill Clinton
Mhm.
there with Yasser Arafat and Prime Minister Rabin, and that's the signing of the Oslo Peace Accords. The leadership here in the U.S. saw that, and they knew that, hey, we need to make some plans, we need to make some changes, we need to think this through because Hamas was ultimately designated in 1997, but even in 1993, they knew that where this was headed, and so they need to come up with plans on how they can continue to do their work, even if Hamas gets designated. So that led to it was a lot of them, probably 2 dozen of them, that met at a hotel in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, on October 1st, 2nd, and 3rd. Thankfully, the FBI was investigating this group and was able to get that room wiretapped. And so for 3 days, they were able to record all of these conversations where folks were talking about, how they're going to sort of, derail the Oslo Peace Accords and continue.
Because if there was peace, they would be out of business. Hamas would be out of business.
Correct. And if you read Hamas's charter, there is no peace until all that land is rid of Jews. And so
Mhm.
they weren't for the Oslo Peace Accords. They used code words. You've probably seen that. They just basically spelled Hamas backwards
Right,
and said Sama.
right.
And they talked about the different ways in which they were going to cloak themselves. One of the organizations I think we'll probably talk about is they decided to, what's the one thing in the United States that we cherish, and as we should, is individuals' civil rights. And so
Mhm.
they know that, and so they know that civil rights is something that Americans cherish. And so they decided to sort of cloak themselves in this civil rights organization that would be able to continue if there are other entities that they had operating, if they were to get shut down.
And that entity was CARE,
And
Council on
that's where,
American, yeah.
yeah, I'm sorry, that's correct. The Council on American Islamic Relations. So this meeting was, again, Oslo was signed in the middle of September of 93. The Philadelphia meeting was the first 3 days in October. And then the following year, I want to say around the summertime of 1994, CARE is registered in Washington, D.C. By three individuals. Two of them were
Mhm.
at the Philadelphia meeting. And then also, so not only does the FBI have them talking about creating CARE, we have two of the three members at the meeting creating CARE. And then also within that trove of documents at that search warrant, we also found documents that show that they have the IAP, the UASR, and the HLF listed as their organizations, but then they had added CARE to it. So
Let's talk about CARE now, because it sounds like what you're saying is that, and from their documents, the CARE was specifically created, and in their documents, it was to legitimize, not be an Islamic organization or a perception as an Islamic organization, but to legitimize what they're doing from an American-facing audience. And so, deception during that Philadelphia meeting, they're talking about war is deception, and the goal is to deceive. And CARE, in fact, is in the business of covering for the existing organizations in case they get dissolved. I mean, that was a quote from one of their documents. So, talk about some of the things that CARE does to deceive the American public. And you might even start. You mentioned that the current national director of CARE was at that Philadelphia meeting. They were an unindicted co-conspirator at that Holy Land Foundation trial in 2007 and 8, which meant that the government had enough evidence to prosecute. They chose not to, but that tied them to Hamas funding. So, what is CARE doing to deceive the public today?
the biggest thing to me is the continual denial of their origins. And I mean, and CARE is it's a large organization. They probably have 30 to 32 chapters across the United States. I don't think I would say that every member of CARE is a member of Hamas or is out to deceive. There could very well be. I haven't spoken to any of that. There could very well be attorneys or employees of CARE in a particular chapter that are doing legitimate civil rights work. Um,
Mhm.
but to me, I go back to its origins, and as you stated, its executive director, longtime executive director since its founding, was at that 1993 meeting when it was decided to create CARE. He was one of the three that was on the registration documents when CARE was created, and they're just again continual denial of their origins. To me, is you have to start with that. Like, let's just acknowledge
Right.
where you came from and who you are, and then they're very they send out a lot of press releases. I'm sure at some point they've done some good civil rights work. Um, but we also, again, it goes back to where they came from.
Do you have any comment on this? They have different messages to the Muslim community than they do to the quote unquote non-Muslim community, where you should believe in the police force. To the Muslim community is don't trust them, don't do anything, don't help them. And then any sort of critique of anything that's Islamic is branded Islamophobia. I mean, you look at CARE's website just a couple of days ago, they
Mhm.
had in 3 days 12 press releases. Three were anti Israel, the rest were all pro Muslim. And under the guise of that, war is deception. And as recently as 2025, the program on extremism reported that a CARE representative was saying he's against the Abraham Accords, that CARE is against. They don't want peace at any cost. And they're still against peace. Can you comment on some of those behaviors?
So the Islamophobia is something I think they've done for a long time, and to me, it's a trap. The fact that I'm here publicly telling you what the FBI had found, and that was produced. I mean, what I'm telling you was introduced at a criminal trial. That's not, to me, that's not Islamophobic. It feeds into their to me, it feeds into their narrative of, well, say you're Islamophobic, now you have to defend yourself. When to me, I'm just calling balls and strikes. Like
Right.
it's just what it is. Their leadership was at that meeting when it was created. We know the reasons why it was created. That hasn't changed. Um, and so to just label someone Islamophobic, again, there's that distinct difference between it's what I said in the beginning is there's a difference between Islamism and Islam, right? So if you believe in Islam, you're a Muslim. So not every Muslim is an Islamist, but that
Right.
Islamist is the one, that's the element in our society that we really need to pay attention on. And I've heard someone the other day say it's like a cancer, like you feel a lump or you don't feel right and you just kind of ignore it. Well, it's going to come back and come back and get you. So you need to understand, like, hey, where are these Islamists in our society and what are they trying to do? We know a lot of history about them, what their objectives are, but we just need to call them for what they are and make sure that they're not, trying to undermine our society and our country.
And to your point, CARE uses the language of civil rights to masquerade as a defender of American pluralism, but instead they're really promoting their Islamist narratives. And I will quote the CEO of the Holy Land Foundation said, because if you're against peace, you're a terrorist. So we have to say it differently. And we as Americans should understand that. So let's move on to the Holy Land Foundation trial. It was 2007 and 8.
Mhm.
One of the pieces of evidence that was introduced at trial was this explanatory memorandum. It was written in 1991 by
Mhm.
Mohammed Akram, who was a member of the board of directors for the Muslim Brotherhood in North America, and he's a senior leader of Hamas. Can
Mhm.
you discuss what that document was, why it's significant today? And I can just quote just a word or two from it. And it said, the role of the brothers in work in America is a kind of grand jihad in eliminating and destroying the Western civilization from within and, quote, sabotaging its miserable house by their hands and the hands of the believers so that it is eliminated and God's religion is made victorious over all other religions. And that's a direct quote from an explanatory memorandum, which is the evidence from the Holy Land Foundation trial.
Yeah, it's one that I have in a presentation. It's one of many. It was a document again that was found. It was written by Muhammad Akram in 1991, and so he talks about understanding the role of the Muslim Brotherhood in America. And I have it because it usually comes up because to me it's the one thing that kind of gets people's attention. So when I kind of explain like, look, there's a difference in my opinion. There's a difference between your ISIS fighter, like what he's trying to do or she's trying to do, and the Islamists, their timelines and their processes the end goal is the same, but the way they get there is just different. And it's really captured, I think, in this paragraph. The process of settlement is a civilization jihadist process with all the word means. The Ikhwan or the Muslim Brotherhood must understand that their work in America is kind of a grand jihad in eliminating and destroying the Western civilization from within and sabotaging its miserable house by their hands and the hands of the believers so that it is eliminated and God's religion is made victorious over all religions. That's different than say we're going to go set off IEDs in New York or in Houston or in Dallas or wherever, whatever city exists. It's a slow process. And
It's just a
so
time frame difference, slow versus fast.
right. There's another analogy I heard was, I have two people in a room that's trying to kill me, one with a gun and one with a knife. And the one with the
They're still going to be
gun,
dead.
the one you're both going to be dead, but the one with a gun would be your ISIS, right? You're right now. But you got to pay attention to the guy with the knife because if you just focus on the one with the gun, before too long, the guy with the knife is going to be on top of
Sure. Okay, so let's move on to Hamas on campus.
it. Mhm.
There is a quote from Representative Jason Smith, who's the chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee. And what he stated was, it's become clear that the explosion of anti Semitic activity on college campuses has been supported and encouraged by bad actors who, in many cases, have used tax exempt organizations for those purposes. So we'll talk about the tax exempt piece in a little bit, but back to that 1988 meeting where the IAP, the Islamic Association of Palestine, was created. That organization became the AMP, the American Muslims for Palestine. And that organization, the AMP, it's a 501(c)(3). It's dedicated to educating the public and advocating for justice in Palestine. And so one of AMP's founders founded the Students for Justice in Palestine, SJP. And that was all that early founder was also part of IAP. So the first chapter of SJP was in Berkeley, and it seems that every campus in America with an SJP chapter has been a source of violence and hate against the Jews. They've been very coordinated after October 7th, too. So, what's the relationship between AMP and SJP activities?
So I think you highlighted it. So AMP, its incorporated name is Americans for Justice in Palestine Educational Foundation. It was founded
Correct.
in 2006 by two individuals who have a history to these other legacy organizations that we're talking about. Especially one, he was a former employee of the IAP and the United Association for Studies and Research that I had mentioned earlier. And then the other individual, he created that first SJP chapter while working at UC Berkeley. That's AMP. SJP, as you said, it's a student network, US campuses. I think the internet says they've got, several hundred
Mhm.
chapters, purports to promote, pro-Palestinian activism. But their agenda does appear to be aligned with, pro-terror narratives that label terrorists as legitimate, resistance, which is another name for Hamas. In the days after the October 7th attack in Israel, that national leadership for SJP, they explicitly endorsed actions of Hamas and armed attacks and um, you know, it, so go to me, it goes back even further. It goes back to that 1993 meeting in Philadelphia, which the folks that we're talking about, they created AMP and SJP, like they weren't at the meeting, but at the meeting that they said, hey, like we need to focus on higher education. And again, they're very strategic and they're very smart. Um, they knew, I think they knew that, like, look, the entities that are training our next policymakers and elected officials are these universities, and so
Yep.
that's who we need to focus on. So to me, that kind of all came to fruition on October 7th when you have the attack, and SJP is sending out toolkits to all their chapters on how to protest and what to say and things like that. And so they normalize this, uh, globalize the intifada again, and they sort of dumb this language down to where you take an 18-year-old or 20-year-old that, God bless them, there are countries best and brightest, I guess, at these colleges, but like they don't, there's a lot of things going on. This is a whole nother webinar. You've got your 18 to 20-year-olds who are, you know, getting pulled into these protests and that's going on campuses, and these people are walking, hey, are you for genocide? Well, who's going to say that it's genocide,
Nobody.
right? And so then it gets flipped around. Okay, well then you're against Israel.
Yeah, and it's propaganda that they're promulgating
And
when.
propaganda, right? And then so you have these 18, 20, 22-year-olds, right? We were all that age at one point where, it's your first time away from your parents, right? So you're still trying to find your identity and your own kind of place in the world. And, you kind of have that feeling that, your generation can do it better than your parents' generation. I mean, I'm not a psychologist, but
Mhm.
to me, it's a very easy group to manipulate. Not saying that there's people within that environment that are just hateful people and just hate
Sure.
Israel. That exists.
Well, we have
Um,
time for one last question, and I want to
yeah, I'm
combine.
sorry, we're
No,
running out
no,
of
no,
time.
no. I want to combine it with a question that came about from the audience, which is about the current status of surveillance, because somebody tried to register for a CARE meeting and got all sorts of interrogations about how they got in and they wouldn't get in. But we have in Texas a 402-acre planned development outside of Josephine, Texas, and it was initially advertised as a Muslim centric community. They ran into problems with the state from fair housing, fraud allegations, and securities violations, and they rebranded this project as the Meadow. So my question is about, there's a surveillance piece to these organizations that are typically they are bad actors, as you pointed out. And what is the government's attempt to limit these type of Muslim enclaves, and how are the community leaders using the US laws, and what sort of reliance can we have on the government understanding and protecting us from our laws being used against us?
Education is a big piece of it, right? To understand what's happening. Enforcing the laws that we currently have in place. We have a lot of them. It's getting those, state lawmakers and sort of the executive side to state government and federal government to, just enforce the laws that we currently have. I'm not aware um, of any, monitoring of, when you say Muslim-centric communities,
That's how
again.
they advertise it, not my
Yeah,
words.
right. Well, okay. So Muslims, like to me, that if they adhere within the laws of the state and the laws of the land, I think that's where it needs to be. Um,
And they didn't. It was a discrimination thing from the FHA. But
right. So they have some lawsuits that are going back and forth between, yeah. So hopefully they'll work that out and
right,
the good
what can the average citizen do to, they used to say watch and report or whatever, but if you don't know what to look for, what do you report? So what does how can we help you in your work other than contribute, which is on your website?
yeah. Um, Again, to me, well, I'm in the education business now, right? So I'm gonna push the education. Education is absolutely key. And I told you before we came on, when we were doing this in 2004, 5, 6, 7 with the FBI, we couldn't get really anybody to listen to us. But the last few years, the demand has been very high. People are wanting to know, hey, what is this? We have different states. You have Florida that I'm in. You have, Texas that are designating some of these things as terrorist entities.
CARE
Again,
is a terrorist organization, listed in transnational terrorist organization,
yeah.
yes,
Yeah, so
and
they're
Florida.
designated again. I think that's a first. So I know there's lawsuits with that, and we'll see how that plays out. Um, Education is just key. Your elected officials are key, making sure that they're sensitive to this. And we educate a lot, not only with folks on your side, but on the legislative side and the executive branch side as well. I still travel to different, law enforcement agencies, the FBI and everything else, and just educate them on it so they know what to look for. Because it is when you have local law enforcement, again, they're looking for where's the imminent threat.
Hmm.
This one's a little different, which is why it's a lot harder,
Right.
it's a lot more complex.
And no, and I didn't have a chance to ask this, but Tom Cotton, Senator Tom Cotton, is calling for an investigation into CARE's tax exempt status and these other tax exempt status because they're violating
Yeah.
tax exempt status. So
Yeah. So that request came from the legislative side. Hopefully the executive side takes that and they'll do.
exactly,
Yeah,
exactly.
for
Well,
sure.
David, thank you so much for your time and your expertise. I want to
Of course.
encourage everyone who's listening to this to go to your website. It's https:// extremism.gw for George Washington University.edu. David has written some very informative articles. He talked about education. It's really, really important. And I want to thank everybody for attending. And we'll be hosting our Israel Now Forum webinars in 2026 on Tuesdays at noon Central. Our next webinar is Tuesday, May the 12th with Rebecca Shaglis. She's director of the K-12 program at CAMERA, which is the Committee for Accuracy in Middle East Reporting and Analysis. We'll be discussing turning back the Red Green Alliance, seizing the reins of power. And our in person Israel Now Forum is scheduled for October the 28th in Dallas. Check out our website for more information and your inbox. Our website is israelnowforum.org. Bye for now.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you, David.
Bye.